Are field spells good? Let's find out. Duel sauce, extra sauce. Hit that subscribe. Hey everyone, I'm Jesse from the Janjo Zone here to talk about field spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah, field spells are kind of interesting. They're a very blanketing card. They affect usually the field, well, more nowadays, kind of your own field. Yeah, see, field spells have really changed since they first came out in Yu-Gi-Oh! When they first came out, you had cards like Forest, Wasteland, Yumi, very generic cards that were just simple buffs to any monster on the field. Like Forest, you'll gain a 200 attack and defense buff to all insects, beasts, plant, and beast warriors on the field. So you had cards like that, and then eventually you'd get ones that would boost even further beyond to Super Saiyan 3 levels with cards like Gaia Power and Molten Destruction, which would increase by 500, which honestly is a pretty significant boost. That's like NECROVALLEY levels. And yeah, NECROVALLEY was kind of a big field spell for its time, wasn't it? Yeah, released towards the later half of 2003. I think it was released in June. I did a whole video on Pharaonic Guardian. I should remember this, but anyway, NECROVALLEY was pretty important for a card because what it did was that it not only increased Gravekeeper, specifically those monsters, by 500 points, but it also prevented cards from affecting the graveyard, whether it's leaving the graveyard or changing its attribute in the graveyard. It blocked out any source of graveyard play, and that was a pretty big thing because all of a sudden you had field spells that could do more than just a simple attack and defense buff. Wait, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't, because that helps me upload more videos and know that you like content like this. And you really didn't see field spells used that much in the anime. Most of the times it was already there in Duelist Kingdom. It was just they happened to be dueling by the water or dueling in a wasteland kind of area, that sort of stuff. So you didn't really get that much crazy really until GX era, when you started to see more cards like SKYSCRAPER, SKYSCRAPER 2, and really Clock Tower Prison is the first one I can think of that was such a drastic change in field spells, because what Clock Tower Prison does is that once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you place a clock counter on the card, and when there are 4 or more, you don't take any battle damage. When it's destroyed, and after that, you can special summon a Destiny Hero Dreadmaster from your hand or deck. So all of a sudden, field spells change from just being a attack boost for a certain type of monster, and it turned into its own unique effect, kind of like a continuous spell at times. And that's probably the biggest change of field spells from the old school era to the modern era, is that it really has changed from a blanketing effect to just another support card, which kind of defeats the purpose of a field spell, I suppose, because half the times they don't even act like they should be a field spell. Look at the more recent card, Galloping Gaia, which does not look like a field spell. It does not look like a type of place monsters would fight in. It just looks like a continuous spell, it's an action that Gaia the Fierce Knight is doing, so that's kind of weird. But you eventually would get good field spells for most every single archetype in the game. Things from Union Hangar to TRICKSTAR Light Stage to TOON Kingdom. TOON Kingdom is a crazy card that really helps toons because it constantly protects them. So the question is that, are field spells good in Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, one, that depends on what format you're talking about, because in early Yu-Gi-Oh, no one really uses field spells that often. Now, I've talked about in my top 5 spicy Yu-Gi-Oh decks with my own Yumi deck that I've made that uses Yumi because no one else uses fish or sea serpent or thunder monsters. This is a very specific kind of deck to use against your opponent. Now, I've seen other decks, and I've also made other decks of similarities, ones that uses Forest, because you can use that to beef up a Pale Beast or Battle Ox, or you can use a Wasteland deck, which would help against another card like Dragon Zombie, becoming an 1800 attack beater. But the problem is with old school Yu-Gi-Oh was that pre-2014, the Master Rules, or before Master Rules, was that if you had a field spell on the field, that could be the only one you had on there. If your opponent placed down their own field spell, it would automatically take over the field and destroy yours. I'm really happy they fixed this mechanic, or at least updated it, they adjusted it, because it's a lot more fun that you can have 2 of them on there and not not worry about your card getting destroyed just because your opponent played something else that had nothing to do with it. You know, it's not like they MST'd or Dust Tornado it. They just set their own field and then bam, that destroys it. So that was kind of the problem with old school field spells, especially if you go back to older formats where if your opponent had one and you had one, then it's really just a game of, do I play it now? Do I play it later? It's definitely a tough thing to think about, and the problem with a lot of the spells, the field spells in 2002, is that cards like Wasteland and Forest, your opponent could potentially benefit off of those. With Wasteland, they could have a Giant Soldier Stone to make it a 22,000 defense booty, or 2200, excuse me. Or Forest, with your opponent most definitely has a Battle Ox, which means that if you don't use yours later in the game before you get rid of your opponents, you're in for some trouble too. And that's why I really like my Yumi deck, because again, no one plays those type of monsters whatsoever. And sometimes you'll see some spice thrown in there. A lot of times it's newer players, they consider, hey, well, if they're not playing this, why, you know, I should play it. I should play Yami to boost up my own Lojin or my Rikishin powered. But then again, your opponent gets those boosts too. It's definitely spicy in some of the later sets released, like in Magic Ruler or 2003 format stuff, where you do have that 500 boost, which is pretty significant. So you can focus more towards a dark beatdown deck or a pyro beatdown deck, that sort of stuff. But I can't think of any top tier deck in the old school era from 2002 to 2005 that really uses field spells. I know there's a Reasoning Fusion Gate kind of deck that you could use that's, I think, is pretty spicy. Apart from that, I'm having a hard time remembering or thinking of any other field spell that's really useful back in that era. If you can think of one, certainly let me know. But it really wasn't until much later, at least in the Synchro era, when they started using more field spells with a card like Black Garden. You know, this one was another kind of big card because it's good for synchro summoning, good for using your Black Rose Dragon and things of that sort. And then, as I mentioned, most archetypes nowadays, they have to have some sort of field spell to really help them get going, because they've changed from just giving a stat boost to being a searching card, typically, or some sort of weird summoning card, or something of the sort that just continuously extends your plays. So field spells have become really important. I mean, hell, that's why you have Terraforming is at 1 copy per deck now, because they're so easy to get cards out. That's why you have other cards like Set Rotation or Ancient Fairy Dragon, cards that really help benefit with field spells, because back then you didn't really care that much about them, but now that they're such a pivotal part for a lot of decks, whether it is Toon Kingdom or Ojama Country, these cards are important for the decks that they're in. So field spells are definitely good in the modern era. I think a lot of people kind of understand that, but the old school era, I don't think they're as good as some people make them out to be. I think there's definitely spice to be had with them, but I won't say they're good, just because if you don't draw into the monsters that really benefit them, if you have one for your own, you kind of have more trouble with that. Like I've mentioned with my Umi deck, that's kind of a problem with it. Sometimes you can also just brick or just not get the cards when you need them. And sure, it can really force your opponent to kind of think other ways, but there's still a lot of downsides that can bring to the deck. But overall, I do like some of the old school field spells. I made a dark Hungry Burger deck that you kind of need cards like that to boost it up. Crab Turtle with Umi Ruka in Spell Ruler is not that bad, but again, with the old school rules, if your opponent just has some field spells, it destroys yours, or if they have their own dark monster, it boosts them up. So you're not really put in a better position a chunk of the time. You're kind of put in the same position, or even worse if you just have bad timing with it, because it can be a dead draw a lot of the times. But nowadays, you have plenty of cards that search other cards out, things like Metaverse, Terraforming, Toon Table of Contents can search Toon Kingdom, a lot of searching cards. So field spells, I'd like to see them at least kind of move back towards, not to make them worse, but kind of more what field spells were meant to be and not be so just crazy effect heavy. You know, I kind of want to see that saved for things like continuous spells, kind of make the spell cards feel a bit different, because they feel too blurred in with each other nowadays, and the only reason that they're field spells is because they look more like a field most of the time, or there's just another way to search them out. But I would like to see them be a bit more generic, and they can still keep to their archetype, but not be just so insanely crazy as a card, because I think there's a lot of potential to have with field spells that make them not so crazily broken. Look at a card like GEARTOWN. I really like that one. It gives a boost. It has an effective destroyed. It's a well-designed card. Or like SKYSCRAPER. You give a special, unique boost to your attacking elemental hero monsters. And that's the kind of stuff I want to see. I love to see a ritual gate at one point where we can just kind of ritual summon anything we want at multiple times, so I can play a really dumb vanilla ritual deck, but that's, you know, my own little thing I'm sprinkling in there. So yeah, let me know what you think about field spells, how you think the direction of field spells have went. What's your favorite field spell art? Because there's a lot of cool art ones for field spells. And if you want to see me do other discussions, let me know what you'd like to see me talk about. Let me know down in the comments below, or wherever else you can find me on various social medias. So yeah, of course, until then, have a wonderful day.